Some were hunted down and executed by former prisoners. Others faced the rope years later after long trials. Many disappeared. This is the brutal fate of Auschwitz guards. Who paid, who didn't, and why. January 17th, 1945. Upper Silesia. Dawn cracks the frost. An order goes out across Auschwitz and its sub-camps: evacuate. SS officers stride the blocks, barking numbers. Prisoners stagger into columns in thin stripes. Those too weak to walk are left behind. The remaining guards torch papers, slam doors, and herd tens of thousands west into the snow. The euphemism, evacuation, hides what it is: a death march. Food is a rumor, water a miracle, and the road's edge a mass grave of ditches and frozen silhouettes. Survivors remember the slap of boots, the dull thud when someone fell, the shot that followed like punctuation. On the ramp at Birkenau, rails gleam, empty. A skeleton crew remains to wreck crematoria and blow up the gas chambers, erasing blueprints with dynamite and fire. Many guards flee the Eastern Front's Red Seam, shedding black uniforms for field gray or civilian coats. Some stitch new identities on the move. A clerk becomes a farmer, an SS block leader becomes a medic. Others ride west with prisoner columns, rifles slung, the authority of a collapsing world still heavy on their shoulders. January 27th, 1945. Oswiecim. Soviet soldiers of the 60th Army walk through the gate. They find a camp that feels like the aftermath of a storm that hasn't ended. Barracks full of skeletal men and women, a hospital of ghosts. Storehouses of hair, shoes, suitcases, evidence piled higher than words. About 7,000 people are liberated here and in satellite sites. A handful of SS are captured on the spot. Most are gone, folded into the Reich's retreating body, scattered along roads, hidden in towns where a new calendar begins and old names become dangerous. February 1945. Silesian backroads. Columns wind toward Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen. The guards' behavior spans a spectrum, from routine cruelty to occasional flashes of pity as the war's end becomes visible, even to those in black. Some shoot stragglers. Some trade bread for watches. Some count steps until the column crosses into another jurisdiction where responsibility becomes someone else's problem. The system is dying, but its reflexes still kill. April 1945. Bergen-Belsen. British troops liberate a camp where people are starving to death in real time. Among the detained SS is a familiar face: Josef Kramer, former commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau during the months when Hungarian transports clogged the ramp and the crematoria failed to keep pace. The British decide to try Kramer and dozens of his staff immediately, the Belsen trial, and to include crimes they committed at Auschwitz. The courtroom is brisk, the verdict's blunt. Kramer is sentenced to death and hanged in December 1945. With him go Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and others whose Auschwitz insignia marked them as functionaries of annihilation. For some Auschwitz guards, the end comes fast, in a British prison yard behind a high brick wall. But Oswiecim lies inside a different post-war reality. The Soviets take statements and move on toward Berlin. Polish investigators arrive with a determination to get to the bottom of the matter. They chart the ruins of blown chambers, map the crematoria's foundations, read ledgers, and record survivor testimony with a precision born of national grief. They start gathering names: commandants, block leaders, female overseers, doctors, clerks, dog handlers, the machine's human inventory. The case that forms is not against a regime in the abstract, but against people who made policy into practice. Some are already far away. One name becomes a whispered absence: Josef Mengele. The doctor of the Zigeuner Lager and the selection ramp walked out in mid-January with folders of notes, slid into the Wehrmacht as a medical officer, and by 1949 was on a boat to South America under an assumed name. His trail will thread through Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. He will drown off a beach in 1979, buried as Wolfgang Gerhard. No judge will question him, no cross-examination will fix his words to the record. For many survivors, Mengele's escape is a wound that never closed, a cruel proof that time can launder the worst among us. Not everyone slips through the net. March 11th, 1946. Northern Germany. British soldiers pull a man from a hayloft near Flensburg. He is quiet, compact, and uses the name Franz Lang. Fingerprints reveal Rudolf Höss, the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz. In Nuremberg, he gives an accountant's confession, numbers of transports, capacities of chambers, the deadly efficiency of Zyklon B. Poland demands extradition. In 1947, a Warsaw court finds him guilty. He writes a final memoir in prison and, on April 16th, is hanged at Auschwitz, near the crematorium whose operations he'd optimized like a factory manager proud of throughput. The rope is not vengeance. It is the state's answer to someone who understood mass murder as a managerial problem and solved it. Meanwhile, the administrative map of post-war Europe hardens. Auschwitz sits in a Poland rebuilt under a Soviet sky. The American and British zones of Germany hold thousands of SS prisoners and millions of displaced persons. Poland asks for extraditions, names tied to the Auschwitz garrison. Over the next years, hundreds are sent east. Some return to find a courtroom where their victims will testify in their native tongue. Others vanish inside the fog of denazification, small-town charity, and the world's rush to rebuild. May 1945. Denmark's border. A column of SS men in ragged order tries to surrender to the British. An officer inquires occupation. A dozen say bookkeeper, another guard, another driver. Papers are thin, memories thinner. The war ends not with a bang, but with paperwork. The fate of many Auschwitz guards will be decided not on the battlefield, but at desks where biographical edits become shields and where overworked interrogators, facing millions of cases, choose triage. Low risk, no evidence, release. The river of impunity begins here. And yet there is also a different current. Survivors, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, Roma, French, Greek, begin to testify for national commissions, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and later for prosecutors who will need names, dates, faces, habits. They recall a woman with a riding whip, a man with a scar, a doctor who whistled as he pointed left and right. This is not gossip. It is a ledger. It will feed indictments in Kraków, 1947, and almost 2 decades later, in Frankfurt, 1963 to 1965, where a different Germany will learn to pronounce the word Auschwitz, not as a distant crime, but as a local address. November 1947. Kraków, Supreme National Tribunal. A high-ceilinged chamber, wooden benches, thin winter light. 40 defendants file in, men in their 30s and 40s, a few women in coats buttoned to the throat. The indictment reads like a map of terror. The black wall in the main camp courtyard. Block 11's basement cells, the women's camp at Birkenau, the Roma family camp liquidated in the summer of 1944. Selections on the ramp that moved with the efficiency of a metronome. The prosecution calls witnesses whose memories have been coiled tight for years. They unspool them with the clarity of people who know that details are a kind of justice. Who stands in the dock? Arthur Lieber-Henschel, commandant after Höss in late 1943 to 44, the administrator's administrator. Gentler in style, deadly in consequence. Maximilian Grabner, head of the camp Gestapo, who turns suspicion into execution lists. Maria Mandl, chief overseer in the women's camp, a name survivors whisper with a mix of fear and precise disdain. Her signature, they say, was a sentence. There are blockführers, capo supervisors, clerks who stamped orders, men who stood on the ramp and pointed, a gesture small enough to fit in a wrist, large enough to erase thousands. The defense strategy is familiar by now. Obedience. Orders from above. I was a functionary. I hit, yes, but I never killed. Polish prosecutors answer with the logic the world will eventually adopt. In a death factory, the work is the crime. You cannot be a harmless cog in a machine built to kill. Your performance of duty there isn't neutral. It is the mechanism by which the killing happens. Witnesses sharpen the point. He stood with a list. She held a stick. He looked at the children and said, "To the left." The tribunal listens, matches names to deeds, and asks questions that make the abstract concrete. The court also sifts distinctions. Not everyone in a uniform did the same thing. Not every cruelty is equal. The prosecution seeks the architects and overseers, and the court's sentences will reflect command responsibility more than rank-and-file brutality. It is not mercy, it is proportionality. And yet the tribunal's bar for criminal participation is not timid. It has to be firm enough to hold the logic of a place that manufactured death as output. A day in court becomes a mosaic. A seamstress from Kraków identifies Mandl by her voice. A miner from Silesia describes the roll calls that lasted until men collapsed, their bodies rolled upright again for counting. A Roma father speaks of the family camp at Birkenau, a rare corner where families were not separated upon arrival, only to be wiped out in one night of smoke. The numbers punctuate the testimony like hammer blows, thousands from Hungary in a day, minutes from selection to chamber, seconds between breath and command. A garrison that peaked near 4,500 SS men and dozens of female supervisors. A system where a job title, Meldegehilfe, messenger, Blockführer, Blockleader, Aufseherin, Overseer, carried lethal consequence. December 22nd, 1947. Sentencing day. The hall is full. Outside, Krakow's winter presses against the windows. The tribunal pronounces 23 death sentences, 17 prison terms ranging from 3 years to life, and one acquittal that shocks the room and will be discussed for decades. Dr. Hans Münch, an SS physician, is cleared after multiple survivors testify that he refused to participate in selections and, in some instances, signed false lab requisitions to keep prisoners out of the gas chambers. The court does not praise him. It simply refuses to convict him of murder because testimony says he persistently opted out. In a world of compulsion, Münch's case becomes a proof of agency, a legal way of saying choices existed and some chose not to kill. Executions follow on January 24, 1948, at Montelupich prison. Among those hanged are Liebe Henschel, Grabner, Mandl, Josef Kramer, Hans Aumeier, and others whose names once patrolled the blocks like weather systems. 2 death sentences are commuted. The rest stand. The rope is not spectacle here. Poland had bled too much for that. The executions are the state's argument that the blueprint of Auschwitz had authors, managers, and signatures, and that signatures carry consequences. The trial's ledger, though, is double-sided. On one page, justice, witness testimony fixed to verdicts, names matched to acts, a legal grammar for the camp's crimes. On the other, a deficit that will never be repaid. Thousands served at Auschwitz. Only a fraction will ever face a judge. Some died during the war. Others vanished under new papers or behind friendly fences. Many will live quiet lives in a new Europe where refrigerators hum and children play in courtyards that do not ask about the past. The math is relentless. Even with Krakow's rigor, even with dozens of other post-war trials, most guards will not stand in a dock. Among the condemned that winter, one figure draws a cold clarity. Maria Mandl. Survivors remembered how she organized the women's camp with a zeal that felt like policy turned personal. Her last words before the drop, reported later, were simple. "Poland lives. They do not redeem her, but they are a reminder that even at the edge of law's power, the nation where so many died speaks through the mechanism of justice and not through revenge." And still, the story of Auschwitz justice is not over. The next chapter opens not in Poland, but in West Germany, in a modern courtroom where democracy will try to judge itself. The mood will be different, slower, drier, constrained by statutes that demand individual intent for murder and that often reduce atrocity to a question of paperwork. Survivors will travel to tell what smoke smells like, and a country will decide whether it can bear to hear its own reflection. December 20th, 1963. Frankfurt am Main. A glass and wood courtroom, microphones neat as lances. 22 defendants sit behind glass. They are not the caricatures from propaganda posters. They are middle-aged, some soft around the jowls, some with the posture of men who have spent years at desks. The judges are German. The prosecutors are German. The press includes reporters from Tel Aviv, Paris, Warsaw, London, New York. There are no Allied flags, no victors standing above the vanquished. This is not Nuremberg. This is the Federal Republic of Germany trying its citizens for crimes committed at Auschwitz. The legal problem is hard and technical. Under West German law at the time, to convict someone of murder, you generally needed to show individual intent tied to a specific act. This person shot that prisoner. This officer ordered that killing. But in Auschwitz, the killing was systemic. The ramp did not operate as a duel. It functioned like a conveyor belt. The prosecution responds with a strategy carefully built from earlier failed cases. Make the system itself the act. If you served in an operational capacity at a death camp, if you guarded the ramp, selected for labor versus gas, oversaw the crematoria, ran the Gestapo office, you participated in murder. The judges do not fully accept this as a blanket rule, but they lean toward it, carving a path through precedent. The names matter. Robert Molker, adjutant to the commandant. Wilhelm Boger, a Gestapo interrogator whose swing became a byword for torture. Oswald Kaduk, the feared Sarge of Birkenau. Franz Lucas, a physician whose role in selections becomes a fulcrum for testimony and partial acquittals. Hans Stark, who as a very young man poured Zyklon B into an opening and later described the act with a voice that shook. Each story pins a thread on the courtroom map. Together they outline a machine. The trial lasts 183 sessions. More than 350 witnesses are heard, over 200 survivors among them. They speak of selections, of the Black Wall, of roll call tortures that turned cold into a weapon, of transports from Hungary that flooded the camp in the spring and summer of 1944 until smoke rose in a permanent column. A woman from Salonika recounts arriving with her family and watching a man in boots point left and right with a motion so casual it felt like an afterthought. A man from Paris describes the Canada warehouses, where the possessions of the dead were sorted, bundled, and monetized. Theft laundered into ledgers. The defense insists on the compartmentalization of guilt. "I did not gas anyone," says a guard who stood on the ramp. "I did not sign orders," says a clerk whose pen moved trains onto schedules. The prosecution answers with documents, maps, and the Höcker album. Photographs of SS staff at a nearby resort, smiling over blueberries and accordion music, while beyond the trees, ashes fell like gray snow. The banality and the proximity collapse the court's distance. Ordinary faces in a sunlit field, chimneys smoking in the frame next door. You can almost hear the nation swallow hard. August 1965. Verdicts. 6 defendants receive life sentences. 10 receive lesser terms, from a few years to more than a decade. 3 are acquitted. The public reaction is mixed. Relief that a reckoning occurred, anger that some men who shoved families toward gas are called merely accessories to murder and will walk free in a few years. Survivors say, in different ways, that what mattered more than the years was the sentences themselves. The fact of guilt pronounced in German on German soil, with German students sitting in the gallery. The trial creates a record. Names cross-examined into facts, maps admitted as exhibits, testimonies sworn under law. That record will become an armor against denial and a quarry for future prosecutors. But the law's limits glare. A man who pulled a trigger may be labeled a murderer and receive life. A man who directed columns on the ramp toward a foregone death may be seen as an accessory and receive 8 years. The difference rests on doctrines of intent shaped for ordinary homicides. Auschwitz was not ordinary. The court tries to stretch the law without breaking it. It partly succeeds. It partly fails. And then the world moves on to wars, missiles, petrol shocks. Memory does not move on. In the 2000s and 2010s, a new legal consensus emerges in Germany, influenced by a landmark case involving a death camp guard. Service in a killing center's operation suffices to convict as an accessory to murder. That doctrine will bring Oskar Gröning, the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, and Reinhold Hanning, a former ramp guard, into courtrooms where the cameras will catch an old man saying simply, "I am ashamed." The point is not the cell. The point is the sentence, the civic sentence that outlives the defendant. April 2015. Lüneburg. A frail man with a tidy part and careful spectacles sits down at the defendant's table. Oskar Gröning, 93, once a low-ranking SS man on the ramp whose job was to count. Tally the stolen money, log the luggage, forward valuables to Berlin. For decades, he insisted he was merely a bookkeeper, a witness to horror, but not its engine. The new legal doctrine, sharpened by modern precedent, says otherwise. If you staffed the mechanism of a death camp, you abetted murder. Gröning is charged with 300,000 counts of accessory to murder, the estimated number killed during the months he served at Birkenau in 1944. He does something unusual for a former SS man in court. He admits moral guilt. "I share morally in the guilt," he tells the judges. He recalls hearing a baby cry on the ramp and watching a fellow guard end the crying with a boot. He says he tried to transfer out after that he could not bear the sight. Witnesses, survivors now in their 80s and 90s, tell the court that clerks like Gröning made the ramp flow, made the confiscations efficient, made the robbery of the dead into paperwork that enriched the Reich. The judges find him guilty and sentence him to 4 years. Appeals and health assessments mean he never serves a day in prison. He dies in 2018. For some, this feels like a second failure. For others, the verdict itself, Germany, 2015, guilty, is the point. February to June, 2016. Detmold. Reinhold Hanning, 94, sits quietly as survivors recount the summer of 1944. He was a guard on the ramp. He says, "People were shot, gassed, and burned. I could smell the burning bodies. I'm ashamed the court convicts him of 170,000 counts of accessory to murder and sentences him to 5 years. He dies during the appeal. The sentence dissolves into the long arithmetic of time, but the record remains. A German court has ruled that a guard who stood at the intake point of death is criminally liable for the deaths that followed. Other late-life cases flicker and fade. Some defendants deemed unfit for trial. Some cases dismissed on procedural grounds. The point, however, has been made across a decade. The justice system, late and limping, has caught up with a legal truth survivors carried since 1945, that the desk, the gate, the ramp were parts of a single weapon. These trials are humanly stark. Defendants arrive with canes and hearing aids. Survivors clutch water bottles and notes written in a hand that shakes less from age than from the return of old rooms. Prosecutors wheel in maps of Birkenau, diagrams of crematoria 2 and 3, transport lists annotated with the efficiency that once fueled murder. They cite the Auschwitz Museum's personnel rolls. About 700 SS in 1941, rising to roughly 3,000 to 3,300 by mid-1944, with women serving as overseers in the women's camp, Aufseherinnen, and at subcamps. Facing those numbers, another statistic cuts. Only a small percentage of the camp's personnel ever faced a court. Law's reach was real. It was also partial. What about the women? The late trials remind the public of what earlier courts already recorded. Irma Grese, a guard at Ravensbrück in Auschwitz, later posted to Belsen, was tried by the British and hanged in 1945 at age 22. Elisabeth Volkenrath as well. In Kraków, Maria Mandl, the women's camp chief, was sentenced to death and executed in 1948. Survivors often remembered women guards vividly because the women's camp was a closed world, smaller, more intimate, more terrifying, where an overseer's mood could become a policy for the day. The point is not to single out gender. It is to mark the systemic participation of both men and women in running Auschwitz as a machine that crushed entire communities into ash and ledger entries. A central absence haunts the late cases. Mengele. The doctor on the ramp who chose with a finger. His post-war flight and 1979 death left thousands without the sight they needed, the sight of him answering questions. In courtrooms where clerks and guards said, "I was small," survivors sometimes looked at the defendant and thought of the man who was not there. Justice is not arithmetic, but the missing one throws every later equation off. And yet, something becomes clearer in these late years. The moral geometry of a death camp cannot be drawn with the straight line of ordinary homicide. Guilt is not a single point. It is a web. A man who opened the cattle car door is connected by design to the man who pointed, to the men who poured pellets, to the drivers, to the clerks who counted rings and watches and converted grief into funding for the war. The late cases make that web visible on courtroom walls, diagrams and charts, and then translate it into law. Participation equals culpability. Some ask, what's the point of convicting a 94-year-old? The answer given by many survivors is disarmingly simple. Naming. A judge's sentence becomes a line that outlives both defendant and witness. It was a crime. In an age that loves euphemism, the line is a necessary instrument. It stops the slide from what happened to what people say happened. Name the system. Auschwitz braided two forms of annihilation, by gas and through labor. Ideology demanded elimination. Industry demanded bodies. The paradox should have broken the machine. It didn't. The solution was a set of routines. Sort arrivals into work and death. Squeeze work from the living until the body collapses. Refill the line with the next transport. Burn the dead. Inventory their possessions. Ship valuables to Berlin. Distribute clothing to ethnic Germans resettled in the East. The act of killing became a workflow. The guards, men and women, were not only sentries, they were operators of a state enterprise whose product was death and whose byproducts were profit and terror. The trials tried to translate this into codes written for bank robberies and bar fights. Polish courts in the late 1940s reached for a sweeping answer. Leaders and active functionaries bear maximum guilt. Those who enacted selections and executions are murderers. Others are accessories. West German courts in the 1960s, constrained by doctrine, demanded proof of personal intent for murder convictions and often labeled rampmen as accessories. The gap in sentences was not a moral difference between nations. It was a difference in legal architecture. Both systems struggled with the same thing: how to treat participation in a structure designed to kill. In time, the law evolved. The modern German doctrine enabling the Gröning and Hanning convictions is a kind of delayed alignment with the lived logic of Auschwitz. If the machine cannot run without you, and if what the machine does is kill, then your service is criminal participation. This development matters beyond the historical record. It matters for future crimes where bureaucracy becomes a weapon, where desk jobs compile lists that lead to graves. Ethically, the terrain is even harder. Primo Levi wrote about the gray zone, a space within the camp where victims were compelled to become instruments of the machinery that devoured them. Sonderkommando, forced to burn bodies. Kapos, compelled to enforce rules on fellow prisoners to survive a little longer. The gray zone never included the SS. Their uniforms were the line. And yet Levi's insight helps explain why survivor testimony sometimes contains rage bent not only at the guards, but at the system that obliterated the ordinary rules of human behavior and then condemned the broken survivors for the breaking. Good trials knew this and kept their focus on the uniforms, even as they allowed the gray zone to complicate the portrait of life inside the wires. Memory has its own system. In the 1950s, West Germany prioritized reconstruction and the containment of the Soviet Union. The German Democratic Republic proclaimed itself anti-fascist and placed guilt at the West's feet. Poland, devastated, pressed hard in the late 1940s, extraditing suspects, charging hundreds, but then settled under a new political chill. Archives closed to the West. Cooperation with West German prosecutors became a diplomatic chessboard. The result, cases delayed, names lost, witnesses scattered by emigration and fear. When Frankfurt opened in the 1960s, it did so at a disadvantage measured not just in years, but in missing paper and fading faces. There was also the ordinary human desire to move on. Family dinners cannot hold the weight of atrocity forever. Children needed parents who could work, not fathers on trial. Communities needed bakers more than they needed confessions. This isn't an excuse. It is a description of the forces that pushed guilt into drawers and turned uniforms into folded keepsakes at the back of closets. So, what can the law do? It can mark a line. It can say, in a killing center, standing your post is not neutral. It can name command responsibility and refuse the shelter of orders. It can accept a survivor's memory as evidence when it is corroborated by maps, rosters, and dates. It can, even late, pronounce a truth robust enough to teach the next generation. But law is not memory, and it is not history's only tool. Museums, especially the grounds at Auschwitz-Birkenau, carry a different authority. Curators stitched together SS personnel lists, guard rotations, photographs, and witness statements into exhibitions that force the mind to stand where the feet are. On ramps, in barracks, near the ruins of chambers dynamited by fleeing hands. School groups trail past piles of shoes and glass cases of hair and see that murder can look like storage. The museum's scholarship feeds prosecutors' files. The prosecutors' transcripts feed the museum's text panels. Together, they keep a public memory louder than any one verdict. Why was so much minimized or forgotten? Because 1945 to 1955 was a decade of ruin and rebuilding. Because nations needed roofs before they needed trials. Because fathers returned from fronts with wounds and stories that did not fit the bedtime hour. Because Cold War borders turned archives into fortresses and turned perpetrators into citizens of convenience behind political curtains. Because survivors had to live, to find apartments, to marry, to raise children who would not inherit their nightmares whole. Silence in those years was not denial. Often it was survival. But silence is not the same as absence. Survivors wrote diaries, gave depositions to national commissions, spoke in synagogues and community halls, built organizations that pressed for trials even when prosecutors were not ready to listen. In 1961, the television era watched the Eichmann trial and learned how to sit with testimony. In 1963 to 65, Frankfurt made German teenagers hear their grandparents' generation described under oath. In the 1980s, a Brazilian grave yielded bones that science matched to a name survivors had been saying for decades, Mengele, and the world learned a different lesson. Sometimes evil dies in its bed, and the only justice left is a line in a report. The 2010s brought something like a coda. A bookkeeper and a guard shuffled into court. One said, "I share morally in the guilt." Another said, "I am ashamed." These are not magic words. They do not right wrongs. They do not return mothers, children, or stolen centuries to communities erased from maps. Some survivors heard those words and felt a weight lift. Others heard them and felt nothing but the echo of a train. But in the public record, the sentences mattered. They made denial harder. They made the civic grammar of Germany more precise. There is debate, and it is fair. Is it justice to convict a 94-year-old who can no longer climb stairs without help? Is it theater, or is it law? The answer depends on what we think justice is for. If it is for punishment alone, the spectacle of an elderly defendant seems hollow. If it is for naming, for teaching, for anchoring memory to law, then the late trials do something only courts can do. They place a stamp beside a name that says guilty, and they do it in the language of the community that once called him neighbor. Let us return to a place, because places remember when people forget. Auschwitz I. The main camp. The black wall is a rebuilt memorial now. Flowers lean in the sun. In Block 11, narrow cells hold air that feels heavy even in summer. A guide's voice is careful, carrying names as if they are warm glass. Across the road at Birkenau, the ramp lies open to a sky larger than memory. The gatehouse is a postcard and a wound. Visitors drift in lines, quiet, a murmur in many languages. They stand on the siding where families stepped down, blinked, asked directions, and were folded into a process that treated breath as a variable to optimize. At the far end, the ruins of crematoria, 2 and 3, slump into the earth like broken bones. Meadow grasses wave through the rubble. Birds strafe the air. The world insists on being beautiful in places where beauty feels like an insult. There is a photograph in a display case. SS personnel at Sollerhütte, the retreat near the camp, singing over an accordion, laughing over berries. In another frame, Oskar Gröning stands at a train, slightly out of focus, a man no one noticed in 1944. In a courtroom in 2015, decades later, he said out loud what the photograph only suggests, that he was there and that there matters forever. Another photo shows a short, tight-faced woman in uniform, Maria Mandl, whose name survivors put into sentences like a blade. Her file ends with a Polish rope. Another shows Rudolf Höss on the stand in Nuremberg, lips pressed thin. His file ends at a scaffold near a brick building a few yards from where school groups now eat sandwiches. And then there are holes where photographs should be. Clerks without portraits, guards whose faces never made a newspaper, drivers who changed their jackets in 1945 and were never asked to explain what they drove. Their absence is part of the story, the proof that systems can hide their operators inside crowds, that history's spotlight can miss people on purpose or by accident. The museum leaves room for them in negative space, the quiet between glass and label. So, what was the brutal fate of the Auschwitz death camp guards after World War II? It was a spectrum. Some met the drop at Hamelin and Kraków within 3 years of liberation. Some served long or short terms in German prisons after Frankfurt cracked the shell of national denial. Some were extradited in the late 1940s, charged and convicted in Polish courts that made early, difficult law from charred ruins and sworn memories. Some hid, built lives, drew pensions, died with grandchildren at their bedsides, who never knew. One of the most infamous ran until his heart stopped in Brazilian surf. In the 2000s, a few very old men sat down in court and listened to the past read itself aloud. Law arrived late. It arrived anyway. The ledger is uneven. The morale is not. The world did not forget, even when it waited too long to remember. Survivors carried the memory across oceans and through decades, held it steady until societies grew ears, until prosecutors found their language, until judges could say, without flinching, this was murder. That sentence is the last defense against a future that loves clean hands. April 16th, 1947. Auschwitz. A scaffold near a brick building. The man who optimized trains and gas now stands under a noose. A lever moves. Wood complains. In the yard beyond, a fragment of wall remembers the crack of shots. The law is not vengeance, but it has weight. It falls in a country where the soil has been asked to hold too many secrets. Nearby, a path of gravel leads to the museum entrance, where, decades later, teenagers will stand at the glass and read the names. Remember the numbers, but do not let them erase people. Remember the early silence, but do not let it swallow the late voices. Remember that in a killing center, standing a post is a choice with a death count. And remember that the last word belongs to those who survived and testified, who built families in the shadow of chimneys and returned to point at a photograph and say, there, that one, I remember his face. Remembering isn't passive. It's resistance. If this widened your map of memory, carry it forward. Keep the names alive. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So, if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read every one and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.